The scream shattered the silence like a hammer through glass. It wasn't loud, it was raw, stretched from somewhere deep, almost animal. Jonah dropped the phone. His knees hit the polished church floor as the voice on the other end said his father's name followed by 2 words. He's gone. There had been no goodbye. No last word. Just absence. Jonah stared at the pews in front of him, rows of empty wood bearing silent witness to the chaos blooming in his chest. He hadn't seen the man in 12 years. Had vowed never to. But grief has its own language. It speaks fluently even when you haven't spoken in years. Behind him, a funeral service was ending. The timing was cruel. Or divine. Jonah's hands trembled as he picked up the phone again, but his fingers couldn't move. You heard me, the voice whispered again. Jonah said nothing. Because he had. And the weight of it was cracking something open in him that had been sealed too long. He didn't cry. Not at first. Jonah simply stood and walked out of the church, his footsteps echoing against stone like a guilty verdict. The air outside was damp, the sky pregnant with rain. His car was parked where it always had been, 3rd row, last space, but now it felt unfamiliar. He opened the door and just sat there staring at the steering wheel like it owed him answers. Then came the first tear. It wasn't for the man who died. It was for the boy who waited every birthday for a call that never came. Jonah whispered, You didn't even try. And the silence that followed felt louder than any apology could have been. The funeral was scheduled for Friday. Jonah hadn't planned to attend. But now, it felt like fate had dragged him into something unfinished. He sat at his kitchen table that night, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold, staring at an unopened envelope marked with his father's handwriting. It had arrived weeks ago, but he'd thrown it into a drawer. Now, it throbbed in his hands like a heartbeat. He wasn't sure what scared him more, that it might be an apology, or that it might not. He opened it. The paper crackled like a ghost waking up. It began with 1 word. Son. That was all it took. Jonah let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The letter didn't ask for forgiveness. It simply told stories of a man who had been too weak, too scared, too broken to love properly. Each line felt like a stone pulled from Jonah's chest and dropped into water. It wasn't enough, but it was something. He read it twice, then once more, and when he folded it back, it felt heavier than when he began. He took the letter and walked to the fireplace. Outside, the rain had begun, soft, persistent. Jonah stared into the embers as if they might offer judgment. Then, slowly, he lowered the letter toward the flame. It caught instantly, curling and blackening. He didn't drop it right away. He held it as it burned until only the edges touched his skin. Only then did he let go. The ashes floated like forgotten memories, brief and gray and gone. And for the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. Jonah hadn't visited his childhood home in nearly 2 decades. The house stood untouched by time but smothered by it, overgrown vines curling like unspoken words around rusted fences. The paint peeled like old memories. He parked at the curb, engine humming for a moment too long before he finally shut it off. The air was thick with nostalgia and dread. This wasn't just a house. It was a museum of every wound he'd hidden. As he stepped onto the path, each footfall sounded like a whisper. Why now? The front door creaked open easier than he expected. Inside, everything was still, too still, like the home had been holding its breath for this moment. His breath caught at the sight of the picture frames lining the hall. None of them showed him older than 12. The living room smelled like dust and closed off years. Jonah moved slowly, his fingers tracing furniture like someone touching the outline of a scar. He found his father's chair, still there, leather worn and sunken, like it missed its occupant but didn't know how to say it. He sat in it. The springs groaned under unfamiliar weight. For a moment, Jonah closed his eyes and imagined being 13 again, sitting across from a man who read the newspaper like it was more important than his son. "You only looked up when I messed up?" Jonah whispered. The house didn't answer, but the silence felt familiar. It always had. He walked into the bedroom next. The bed was made. Tidy-dyed. Military even. That was his father. Order over warmth. On the dresser sat a faded baseball glove, the one Jonah had begged him to use once. Just once. But the glove had never softened. Just like the man. Jonah picked it up. The leather cracked as it bent for the first time in years. He tried it on. It didn't fit. Wasn't supposed to. He set it down, not gently. Then, caught between guilt and anger, he stood at the mirror. Stared. "Do I look like you?" he asked. And in that moment, he saw it. The eyes. The sadness. The stubbornness. A curse passed down like a family heirloom. The attic stairs creaked like confession. Dust rose in clouds as Jonah pulled the cord and climbed slowly, each step a crunch of time and regret. The attic hadn't changed. Cardboard boxes labeled in faded ink. One read, "Jonah's school stuff." His heart jumped. He opened it. Inside, report cards, a Father's Day card with shaky handwriting, and a school photo where he smiled with too many teeth. But at the bottom, folded carefully, was a drawing he made at 8 years old. A boy and his dad holding hands under a crooked sun. Jonah stared at it for a long time. Then he laughed. Not out of joy, but the kind of laugh that comes from knowing you spent your whole life wishing someone believed in that picture more than you did. Jonah sat on the attic floor for hours, not moving, just holding the drawing. It was the first time he realized how much of his life had been shaped by that simple image, hope that one day his father would become the man in that sketch. He never did. And Jonah had never stopped waiting. That's what broke him. Not the man his father was, but the one he never became. That night, Jonah didn't sleep in the guest room. He laid down in his father's bed, fully clothed, the house sighing around him like it had waited years for this moment. And as he stared at the ceiling, he whispered, "I'm not angry anymore." But even he didn't believe it yet. Morning came gray and indifferent. Jonah stood in the kitchen, coffee in hand, watching a family of birds pick at the lawn. Life moved forward, even here. But his didn't. Not yet. The doorbell rang. A woman stood on the porch, mid-60s, sharp eyes that had once held warmth. Aunt Marie. She hadn't changed much, except now her kindness was lined with caution. "You came," she said, voice wrapped in years of withheld judgment. Jonah nodded. Didn't plan to. She stepped inside, looked around like the house itself might accuse her. "He left something for you. Told me to hold it in case you ever came back." Jonah blinked. Why would he think I'd come back? She didn't answer. Just handed him a small locked box. It was light, but it felt heavy. Jonah placed the box on the kitchen table and stared at it like it might explode. It had a brass lock, old, ornamental. No key. He turned it over, searching, then looked around the kitchen like the walls might offer a clue. Nothing. Nothing. Frustrated, he shoved it aside, but it clattered against the table and popped slightly open. Inside, a bundle of cassette tapes, labeled by year. His breath caught. The first said 1998, Jonah's Game. Hands shaking, he found an old tape player in the hallway closet, covered in dust and childhood. He pressed play. Static. Then his father's voice, younger, clearer. "Jonah, I missed your game today. I wanted to say I'm proud of you. I'm just not good at saying it out loud." Jonah froze. His entire childhood had felt like silence. But this was a voice behind the wall. He listened to all of them. Each tape a breadcrumb of a man who never figured out how to speak in the moment, but recorded his regrets afterward. Missed birthdays. Unspoken apologies. Hidden pride. There were moments of static, of silence, of things half said and quickly swallowed. Jonah sat through them all, arms wrapped around himself like a child hiding from thunder. He wasn't sure what stung more, knowing his father had tried, or knowing he never knew. At the end of the final tape, there was a long pause. Then, a single line. "I'm sorry for how I loved you. I thought distance would protect you from me." Jonah exhaled like something had punched through his chest. Distance hadn't protected him. It had imprisoned him. That night, Jonah walked the neighborhood. The same cracked sidewalks where he learned to ride a bike. The lamppost he once hit with his training wheels still leaned slightly to the right. He passed the old corner store where his father once bought him licorice after a tantrum. Memory wasn't linear. It crashed over him in waves, sometimes warm, sometimes suffocating. He stopped at the park where they used to sit in silence. Just him, his father, and a bench that said nothing but held everything. Jonah sat there now. He whispered, "Why didn't you just try harder?" A breeze answered, rustling dry leaves like fading laughter. Maybe ghosts didn't talk because they'd said too little when they were alive. Jonah returned home with something new in his eyes, grief, but not just for the father who died. For the version of himself that had waited so long for something that never came. In the hallway he found a photo he'd missed before. Him and his father at the beach. He was maybe 5. His father's hand on his shoulder, both of them squinting at the sun. It was the only photo where they were touching. He stared at it, fingers gently brushing the glass. "We weren't good at it, were we?" he whispered. Then something shifted. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the beginning of something that looked like it. A crack in the wall. A breath after holding it too long. The next morning, Jonah was cleaning out the garage when he found an old filing cabinet buried beneath tarp and rust. It squealed open with protest like it hadn't been touched in years. Inside were scattered documents, yellowed pay stubs and torn envelopes. But wedged in the back was a thick sealed manila folder, marked private. Not for Jonah. His heart stopped. His name, written in his father's stiff, angular handwriting. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside were legal papers, custody documents, court transcripts, letters from his mother's attorney. Jonah blinked. It didn't make sense. Then the line hit him. Full custodial rights signed over for the child's safety, by mutual agreement. His hands shook. He had always believed his father abandoned them. But this said something else. Something harder to hate. He reread the papers, this time slower, breathing between lines. His mother had fought hard for full custody, accused his father of being emotionally unstable. The court had agreed. His father hadn't fought it. Or so Jonah had thought. Until he found a torn letter, tucked behind the transcripts, a page never sent. His father had written, "I didn't leave. I was told leaving was better for him than watching me unravel. I thought it would hurt less that way." Jonah's fingers went numb. All those years of hating him, of assuming the silence was chosen. But what if the silence was survival? What if walking away had been the only act of love his father could give? Jonah sat on the garage floor, legs folded like a child, the papers spread around him like a broken puzzle. For the first time he let himself remember differently, not as the boy who was left, but as the boy someone tried to protect, and failed anyway. Memory bent in strange ways. He remembered his mother crying in the kitchen, whispering things she thought he couldn't hear. He remembered asking questions and being told to stop. He remembered silence wrapped in safety and lies. His father didn't raise him, but his absence had. That was the new wound, realizing you had blamed the wrong ghost. Jonah whispered, "You didn't abandon me. You were erased." That evening, Aunt Marie returned. Jonah opened the door before she even knocked. He held the letter. "Did you know?" he asked, voice steady but trembling beneath. She didn't answer right away. Just walked in, sat down and said, "I begged him to fight. But he wasn't built for courtrooms. He was built for guilt. And your mother," she was afraid, of what he might pass down. His darkness, his father's. Jonah felt the weight of generations suddenly pressing on his chest. "And you never told me?" She met his gaze. "You were a child. We thought protecting you meant editing the story." Jonah sat beside her, the silence between them no longer hostile, but tragic. That night, Jonah stood in the backyard, beneath a cold sky. The stars were sharp and indifferent. He held the cassette, labeled Final. It hadn't been played yet. He placed it into the recorder with trembling hands. His father's voice came through, aged and fragile. "If you're hearing this, I'm gone. And maybe you've already cursed my name. Maybe you should, but I want you to know, I loved you every day. I just didn't know how to be the kind of man you needed. I was afraid I'd turn you into me." Jonah closed his eyes. The voice continued, "But if you're nothing like me, if you forgive when I couldn't, then maybe I did one thing right." Jonah stood still for a long time. The tape clicked off, and the silence that followed felt almost holy. The next morning, Jonah stood at the edge of the cemetery. The wind was sharp, biting through his coat like judgment. Rows of gravestones stretched before him, cold names etched into colder stone. His father's grave was fresh, damp earth piled in uneven mounds, the marker temporary and crude. Jonah hadn't brought flowers. He brought the tapes. All of them, in a brown paper bag. He knelt, not in reverence but confrontation. "You should have stayed," he said quietly. "You should fought for me." His hand trembled as he set the tapes down. "But I guess, maybe you were fighting in your own way." The wind didn't answer. But for the first time it didn't sting as much. Jonah reached into the bag, pulled out the final tape, and placed it gently atop the soil. "This belongs here," he whispered. "All of it does." He paused, eyes scanning the stone. "I carried your silence for too long. Now I'm giving it back." He didn't cry. Not yet. Not. But there was something breaking inside him, not out of pain, but out of release. He stood slowly, knees aching. The grave didn't change. The wind kept blowing. But Jonah's spine straightened. His breath came easier. It wasn't closure. Closure is clean. This was messier, but it was his. And maybe that was enough. He left the cemetery and drove without thinking. His hands knew the way before his mind did. It wasn't until he pulled into a quiet cul-de-sac that he realized where he was. His mother's old neighborhood. She had passed years ago, but the house remained, untouched. Jonah hadn't stepped foot there since the funeral. But now, it called to him. He stood at the gate, fingers brushing the rusted latch, memories slamming into him like waves. Her voice, her rules, her warnings. "He's not safe. He'll break you. Forget him." Jonah whispered, "You lied to me." And for the first time, the anger wasn't toward his father. It was toward the half of the story that had silenced the other. Inside the house, everything was as it had been. Framed smiles on the walls. Doilies on the tables. His mother's life preserved like a museum of denial. Jonah wandered through it slowly, touching nothing. In her study, he found her journals. Page after page, tight handwriting. Lists. Routines. Diet. Worries. Then buried in the back, Jonah asked again about his father today. "I told him what I had to. Not all truths help a child sleep at night." Jonah sat down, breath shallow. She had loved him fiercely, but her love had come with blinders. Protection and manipulation had worn the same face. He closed the book, hands shaking. "You were scared," he said aloud. "But you made me scared of him too." That night, Jonah returned to his father's house and sat in the chair, the one that once held nothing but resentment. Now, it held something else. Understanding, maybe. Or just exhaustion. He pulled out a sheet of paper and began to write. Not to anyone. Just out loud. Everything he never said. Everything he needed someone to hear. He wrote until his hand ached, until the moon moved higher in the sky. Then he folded the letter, placed it on the table, and whispered, "You tried. I see that now. And I think I'm starting to forgive you, not for leaving, but for being too broken to stay." For the first time in years he slept in that house. And this time, the silence wasn't cruel. It was calm. The morning light felt different, softer, as if the house had exhaled overnight. Jonah stood in the kitchen, holding a chipped mug his father must have used 1,000 times. It wasn't much, but it was something real, unhidden. He sipped the lukewarm coffee and watched the trees outside sway gently in the breeze. No voices in his head, no silent accusations, just the stillness of a moment finally earned. For so long he'd lived as a man unfinished, defined by the absence of a father, the silence of his upbringing. But maybe that silence had finally said something. Not an apology, not an excuse, but a truth. And truth, even late, is still truth. Jonah began cleaning the house, not to erase the past, but to live inside it differently. He didn't throw everything out. Some things he kept, the tape player, one photo, the leather chair. He boxed up the rest with care, labeling each piece like a historian, not a son. It wasn't bitterness guiding him anymore. It was balance. He realized healing didn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it came from washing the windows, from folding the shirt left hanging behind the door, from deciding to let a memory breathe without suffocating under it. For the first time, the house began to feel less like a graveyard, and more like a story you could live inside, without flinching. He made one final visit to the attic. The drawing was still there, the boy and his father under that crooked sun. Jonah didn't cry this time. He just smiled softly at the honesty of that child's hope. He placed the picture in a frame and set it near the front hallway. Not as a tribute, not as a lie, but as a reminder, some dreams don't come true, but they shape you all the same. The boy who drew that picture didn't get the father he imagined, but he became a man who could face the truth and choose what not to carry forward. That was enough. That was freedom. Weeks passed. Jonah didn't stay in the house forever, but before he left, he repainted the front door, a deep, calming blue. Small, deliberate. As he stepped back and looked at it, he smiled. "You wouldn't have chosen this color," he said aloud, imagining his father grumbling about it being too soft. But that was the point. The softness was his. The choice was his. He'd inherited more than silence. He'd inherited the chance to end it. And that, he realized, was the most sacred thing a broken father could give his son, a chance to be something else. Before driving away, Jonah stood beside the car, hand resting on the roof. The house behind him didn't feel like a place of ghosts anymore. It felt like something honest. A chapter finished, not forgotten. He looked down the street, the one he once rode a bike down, wobbling and terrified. He wasn't that boy anymore. But in a way, he had just caught up to him. He opened the car door, paused, and whispered, "Goodbye, Dad." Not angry, not bitter, just clear. Then he got in, started the engine, and drove off. The road was long, but now it was his. Jonah didn't move back to the city right away. He rented a small cabin upstate for a few weeks. No signal, no deadlines, just trees and quiet. He needed a place where he could hear his own thoughts without them sounding like echoes. Mornings came gently there. He'd make coffee, sit on the porch and listen to birds instead of regret. One day, he opened a notebook and wrote one sentence: "You can't heal what you pretend didn't happen." He stared at the words for a long time. That sentence wasn't about his father anymore. It was about himself, the man who finally let himself stop pretending. He went hiking one afternoon and found a clearing with a single tree standing in its center, bent but unbroken. It reminded him of his father. Flawed, dead, weathered, still standing. He stood beneath it and looked up at its branches, twisted, reaching, stubborn. I wish you had known how to stay, he said, almost to himself. Then, after a pause, but I'm learning how to. Jonah didn't need the tree to respond. It had already survived its own storms. That was enough. He placed his hand on the bark. Rough. Wah. Real. Wah. Like everything that mattered. In a small town diner nearby, Jonah found himself laughing. Not forced, not polite, genuine. It startled him. The waitress had joked about his messy handwriting on the check, and something about her tone had reminded him of his own. He laughed. And it felt good. Strange, but good. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant being able to smile without guilt. To feel joy without betrayal. That was the truest peace he'd ever known, not pretending the pain hadn't happened, but letting it live beside his happiness without poisoning it. Before leaving the cabin, Jonah buried the last cassette in the woods near the clearing. No ceremony. No drama. Just intention. He placed it into the soil like a seed. Something that once hurt, now laid to rest. This doesn't need to follow me anymore, he said. Not because it didn't matter, but because it had done its job. It had taught him who he wasn't, who he could be. The dirt felt cool in his hands. The air smelled clean. And for the first time in his life, Jonah didn't feel like a man mourning something lost. He felt like someone finally planting something worth growing. Months later, Jonah stood in a park watching a young father chase his child through the grass. Laughter rang like wind chimes. He didn't envy them. He didn't hate. He just watched. He'd carried grief like it was a duty. But now, it had become something else. Wisdom, maybe. Or grace. As the boy jumped into his father's arms, Jonah smiled. Not because he wished it had been him, but because he was finally able to say, "That's beautiful," and mean it. Some stories don't get rewritten. They get retold. This time, with softer words. And some wounds don't need to heal to stop hurting. They just need to be seen.